I'm Scott.
I'm Bill.
And we're the Trade Guys.
You're listening to The Trade Guys, a podcast produced by CSIS where we talk about trade in terms that everyone can understand. I'm H. Andrew Schwartz, and I'm here with Scott Miller and Bill Reinsch, the CSIS Trade Guys.
You're listening to The Trade Guys. This week, we have an update on the EU's EV tariffs, a rundown on potential congressional trade action before the new administration, and we'll also explore a report on U.S. diversification away from China by the Rhodium Group. All this and more on The Trade Guys. Hello, and welcome back to The Trade Guys. Evan Brown here again to steer the Trade Guys ship. So today we're going to start by checking back in on the EU's EV tariffs and what seems like may be becoming an escalating trade dispute with China. So as a reminder, the EU's additional duties of up to a revised 37.6% on Chinese battery EVs provisionally took effect on July 5th. You all can go back to our June 24th episode for more details on that. But now it sounds like China is challenging these tariffs at the WTO. What are your expectations for how that will go? And what should we expect going forward?
Well, it's an interesting problem only because it's something we're likely to see a lot of. It's sort of a preview of coming attractions, if I can put it that way. And it is the fact that, as I see it at least, we're in a mode of green industrial policy, whether it's the climate change initiatives and the actions to support industries in helping to get to net zero, or whatever the goals are of carbon footprint reduction. They are coming in conflict with some of the more fundamental aspects of international trade rules, specifically the rules on non-discrimination and the disciplines on industrial subsidies. And so this is a conflict we haven't deconflicted it yet. It's going to happen, and it's not obviously clear what's going to happen in either this case or any, but I think we'll see a lot of this in the coming years. Now, what China has done is noted that while they are being accused of subsidy and dumping with their vehicles, and so it's a trade remedies case that escalated into a WTO dispute. They've had relative success in the low end of the electric vehicle market in Europe. China is, of course, pleading they want to help the world with manage climate change, and excluding their vehicles from Europe is unfair and against the rules. So that remains for another day. But for me, what the backstory is here, and the story that we got to watch, is that you have a situation where electric vehicles are very interesting. They're an alternative to internal combustion engine vehicles, and they have strengths and weaknesses versus other kinds of vehicles. What we have is a situation where governments have decided electric vehicles are really good and we want them. And by the government saying that we think these vehicles are really good and we want them, there are subsidies everywhere. And so while this is at one level, the Europeans are accusing the Chinese of subsidy and dumping. Frankly, as I see it, electric vehicles are subsidies all the way down. All right. Everybody, they have a presence in the marketplace as fast as they have because production is being subsidized, at least in the United States. Consumption is being subsidized. And much like China, the U.S. has mandates with how much of the fleet. We cloak it in corporate average fuel economy regulation. China just did their command economy thing and said, thou shalt buy an electric vehicle. Whatever it is, this is an industry that is subject to government distortion on all sides. And to the extent that consumers somewhat left out of the conversation. And I think the consumers ought to be heard from at some point because there are real trade-offs. As I said, EVs are interesting in certain applications. They have strengths and weaknesses. People are finding out that they're more expensive to insure. They depreciate faster. There's some downsides that weren't there initially. We'll see how that shakes out. There are definitely some upsides in terms of quiet operation and somewhat simplicity of the vehicle, but it all has to be sorted out. And by excluding Chinese vehicles from the European markets, Europe is doing what the United States did previously, which is ensure that electric vehicles of a certain service size and capacity and specification is more expensive than its internal combustion engine alternative. China has dealt with this problem according to the IEA, where they have roughly equivalent costs for equivalent performance/service and capacity of internal combustion vehicles versus battery vehicles, which says to me there's a lot more innovation going on in the market in China than we see in the US or in Europe. We're essentially making sure there are no low-end vehicles available to consumers. I don't know if that's fair to EVs. I don't know what happens at the end of it all. As a general matter, we've got that difficulty where the governments have decided on a policy and everybody's subsidizing. So while the Chinese are being accused of subsidy, no one's hands are clean. Separately, you have global companies involved in this for the most part. It's a sensitive issue because the European manufacturers, particularly the Germans, are heavily invested in China. Volkswagen has massive facilities there, as do the other German companies. They have big sales operations. There is an inherent conflict when global companies are forced into national policies. So it makes life complicated, but it particularly strains the system in this case. So we'll have to watch this. I just think it's going to happen a lot. We really need deconflicting.
Excellent overview by Scott. As usual, more in the weeds on trade law than he is on this. So I have a couple disconnected thoughts. First of all, Europeans are following the rules in contrast to the Biden administration, which just slapped 100% tariffs on EVs. Europeans have actually gone through an anti-dumping, anti-subsidization investigation using procedures that are not all that different from ours. And they came up with these numbers based on their analysis of the amount of Chinese subsidies. They've taken some pains to do it in a way that is consistent with WTO rules. Chinese have already complained to the WTO and filed a complaint, and they will argue that the Europeans are not doing that. We'll see how that plays out. But on its face, they've taken considerable pains to try to conform to the rules, use regular order. Now, at the same time, I think you should keep in mind that if you look at the history of the EU's use of these rules over time, particularly with respect to non-market economies. An example, the outcome often ends in a deal. They announce a subsidy. The other side comes in and says, well, maybe we can talk about this, which I understand has happened. There are negotiations going on. And often in the end, they cut a deal, the outlines of which are that it goes forward, and a duty is assessed, or some kind of, if not a duty, a voluntary restraint by the Chinese on exports. A quantitative limit might be a deal, but they usually cut a deal, and then the litigation tends to go away. That will be harder in this case. Don't rule it out, and stay tuned. I think the second thing to keep in mind is that most of the debate about EVs so far has been focused on supply. How many of these things are being built in various countries? There's not been a lot of analysis yet about demand. And that's something that I think is going to need and going to get more attention going forward, because there is some growing evidence that demand is not accelerating as fast as people thought it was going to accelerate. There are some products, steel being a good example, that are fairly fungible where the market really depends on price. An automobile is a consumer item, so the consumer buys it or he doesn't buy it. Which one he buys is due to a whole bunch of factors that are not simply based on price or whether it's electric or not, but based on design, other features, relevant, access to charging stations that fit the model he's looking at, and a whole host of factors. Early indications are, certainly in the United States, that demand may not be growing as fast as people think, which may upend some of the supply calculations and some of the plans that companies have going forward. On that, we'll just have to wait and see. The United States is a market economy, and the market actually has something to do with this stuff. And if people don't want to buy them, that's going to have an impact on how many of these things get made and on a bunch of the other issues that Scott was talking about. The third thing, or the fourth thing, I've forgotten what number I'm on. From the European perspective, this is all part and parcel of the Chinese overcapacity problem. We've talked about this before, and this is the latest example following steel, aluminum, wind turbines, solar panels, and other things on the way, I would argue commercial aircraft, where, the state has invested billions of RMB and billions of euros in subsidizing these plants. They're producing more than Chinese demand can soak up, and that gets dumped on the rest of the world. And as Scott said, stay tuned for this, because we are now starting to see other countries catch on. So it's not just us. Now we've got the EU taking this action. We've got the Indians, we've got the Brazilians, we've got the South Africans, we've got the Indonesians, in that case, textiles. It's not all about EVs. But in each of these cases, you've got governments that are pushing back against Chinese dumped and subsidized goods. That's going to turn out to be an important thing, because if you can't approach this problem collectively, then each country is just squeezing the balloon and it just pops out somewhere else. So I think what the EU is doing is a good sign, although the economists will say that there's a real question about whether the tariffs they're going to impose are high enough to actually keep the Chinese out of the market. Of course, the European response to that is to say that the goal is not to keep them out of the market. The goal is to equalize the playing field and put everybody on equal economic terms, which is the right thing to say because that's the goal of the statute. The U.S. goal is a little simpler. It's to keep them out of the market. Kind of a fundamental difference right now between the EU and the Europeans.
Stay tuned. Stay tuned.
Exactly. So now let's return to Bill's longtime workplace, the U.S. Capitol building. There's been some movement on the Hill in recent weeks on bills that would reform both the de minimis requirement as well as outbound investment, both with an eye towards China. And there's also talk of renewing the GSP, the Generalized System of Preferences, which expired in 2020. Guys, do you think that this soon-to-be lame duck Congress will be able to get any of this across the finish line?
Well, there's two time periods, before the election and after the election. Before the election, I think the answer is no. Sometimes there's an effort to do some things before the election so members of Congress can go back and brag about what they've done. None of this stuff is big enough to brag about, frankly, and it's just not on the radar of the ordinary voter. So I think the issue will be lame duck or not. And when you get into the lame duck session, it's an obvious place to look for stuff like this. There are actually competing pressures that come to play, some of them depending on the election outcome. There is always pressure to finish stuff. You know, these things have been pending for a long time. GSP has been expired for 4 years. De minimis has been debated extensively for 2. The miscellaneous tariff bill has been expired, I think now 3 years. There's going to be pressure to say, let's just get these things done. The counter pressure comes when the election produces a change of control anywhere, House, Senate, or White House, because the incoming party that was out of power is always going to say, let's wait until we're in power and we'll take care of it. So if the Republicans are coming into the White House, they're going to tell the Congress, don't do any of this stuff. Let's wait for the Trump administration to see what he wants to do. And you can count on Republicans in the House and the Senate to respect that and not to honor it. Likewise, if control of either body switches, and that could well happen, in fact, it could happen in both, the Senate going Republican and the House going Democratic. If that happens, you're going to have the incoming party, whichever one it is, saying it's kind of the same thing. Let's wait till January because we can do it better than those guys can do it. So there are competing pressures here that make coming to a conclusion about anything difficult. That said, this stuff ought not to be controversial. You know, the top line tends to be most people are for GSP renewal. Most people are for a de minimis fix. Most people are for renewing AGOA, which Evan didn't mention, but which is on the table, although I don't think that's going to play out this year. The problems are several. The one I just alluded to. The other problem is that even though people are for these in a 40,000 foot sense, there's actually sharp disagreement over the details of each individual provision. There are now, I believe, 4 separate de minimis proposals pending in the Congress. They are all designed to stick it to China one way or the other, but they all do it in different ways. One simply cuts China out. One cuts out everything covered by the 301 tariffs. One cuts out basically non-market economies. There's a mixed bag, and the members have to decide, between them which way they want to go because they're all different. The differences are important because what gets affected, I think the fourth one would focus on specific sectors, most prominently textiles, which means they're going after Xi'an and Temu. So do you want to cut off textiles? Do you want to cut off everything? Do you want to just look at where the 301 tariffs apply? Different views on that, and that's going to take debate, which uses up floor time. Likewise, on the China issues, the Speaker of the House has said we're going to have China Week. It's rumored to be the week of, I think, September 19th or thereabouts. It's still not clear what that's going to consist of. There again, there are competing bills. He's talked about, let's do an outbound investment review bill. This will be attempt number 5, I believe, to pass this bill. It's not made it across the finish line the previous 4 times. I think I had said on a previous podcast, and in the world of baseball, 3 strikes and you're out, but that doesn't happen in the world of trade legislation. We're now on strike 5. And in the House, at least, there are 2 competing versions with important differences. One focuses on sectors. Let's require reviews for investment in, say, semiconductors or in machine tools or in, you name the sector. The other approach is let's do it by bad companies. If you're on one of the government's numerous lists of bad guys, you can't invest in them. That's a clearer line. I mean, companies don't like either of these, but I think if they had to choose, they'd favor the second one because it's clearer for them. You've got 2 separate committees that are supporting. The Foreign Affairs Committee has approved the first one. The Financial Services Committee supports the second one. And you've got 2 senior leaders there, Congressman McCall and Congressman McHenry, both of whom support their version and oppose the other one. They're all going to say, yeah, we need to do this. But getting there is going to be much more difficult than they think. And the overlay, at least in the House, and these are all revenue bills, by the way. So the House is supposed to act first. And the Senate's not an afterthought because it doesn't get to the president unless the Senate acts, but the House gets the first move. The other issue there is the process issue. The Ways and Means Committee approved some of these things, but the Democrats opposed all of them because the House did not approve renewing the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program. And that's probably worthy of a separate conversation. But the Democrats are saying, if you don't do TAA, we won't support the rest of this stuff. That makes this a partisan argument. And while the Republicans may have the votes, they don't have the votes in the Senate. And so if you're going to try to get all these things through, I think they're going to have to work something out on that. And there's no sign of that happening. So my bottom line is gloom on finally getting something done. But I do think in the lame duck session, there'll be a run at it. There are members that have an investment in this. They're the authors of these various bills. They would like to, put another notch in their holster or whatever, put notches in these days, and say, I did that. So the effort will be made. I'd be surprised, though, if it succeeds.
Well, lest we blame it all on those crazy characters in the House of Representatives, they do act crazily once in a while, particularly in lame duck sessions when you have about 50 who have either moved on to another office or lost their reelection bid because they really don't want to be there meeting with constituents and working on issues. But having said that, I think it would be remiss of us if we did not mention that were there an aggressive negotiating agenda by the administration, were the USTR to have a whole series of things that they were trying to get done that was part of an approved negotiating agenda for market access anywhere, these issues would have a way to align and come together. You'd have a way to force the decisions to get them to a point that they're ready for action. And I think the absence of any serious market access negotiations on any front, which I think is a fair summary of the current state of trade negotiations, makes the freelancing that's going on in the House much more difficult to resolve and move constructively. So I'll leave it at that.
And we will wait and see, and you can trust the trade guys to return in November with new predictions about that.
Yes. We hope you forget some of our old predictions. We'll remind you of the ones that did come true, but
that's what I've said many times. It's a wonderful thing about the consulting business. Nobody remembers when you're wrong because they've moved on to other stuff. And we will remind you when we're right. You can be sure of that.
Yeah, I've heard from our data people that amnesiacs are the top listeners of the Trade Guys podcast.
Good to know. And we love you all.
Insomniacs got to rank right up there, that's for sure.
Yes, that too. I talked to one of those once. Great conversation. I put the earbuds in when I'm going to bed, and I thought, good to know.
We're awesome.
Let's wrap up with a recent report from the Rhodium Group, which I know you both found interesting, on supply chain diversification away from China. What stands out to you all here, and what does this report tell us about U.S. efforts to de-risk?
It's a really interesting report that I think deserves closer study. They concluded that diversification, which is their word, I think they said that, they talked about decoupling, de-risking, thought that there wasn't a lot of difference, noted that there's been a number of shocks to the system lately, the invasion of Ukraine, COVID in particular, have accelerated this process of diversification. But it's underway. You can see it in the data about China's decreasing share of U.S. imports and decreasing for inbound foreign direct investment over the past 7 years. They conclude that in the short term, the winners, if that's the right word, are namely Mexico and Vietnam, which is what we flagged in previous episodes, and that in turn, with those countries, presents a risk of capacity constraints and rising costs. We have also seen a little bit of, is Vietnam getting full? Is there room for more diversification there or not? Power supply, water, supply of workers, issues like that matter when you're thinking about investment. That we knew about. The thing that's new in the report that intrigued me is, first of all, that the efforts are concentrated in a few sectors, namely electronics, autos, and textiles. And they're also concentrated in final assembly rather than upstream parts and components. So a lot of the Chinese companies that are diversifying are also the Western companies that are diversifying. And the Chinese are doing this too. It's not just Westerners. They continue to rely on Chinese parts and components. And what they're doing in these other countries is putting them together, which also gives them the benefit of making them originating in that country for customs purposes. So that was an interesting take that I hadn't thought about. There are potentially other winners that they talk about, and they mention Canada, Taiwan, Germany, and South Korea are picking up trade and direct investment shares. They think that other countries are not. And interestingly, they flag Japan, Australia, and the Philippines as absent from the list of hotspots. We'll have to figure out why and if that stays that way. But the other interesting thing is that the reason for what's going on and why people go where they go has two standout factors, which I hadn't really thought about. One is the availability of workforces with basic to advanced skill sets. And second, I love this one, the role of high-quality cross-border economic agreements. And for the trade guys, that's music to our ears. Trade agreements actually produce more diversification. And if you think about it, it's not rocket science, because what trade agreements do is create stability and certainty for investment. So if you know what the rules are, if you've got a trade agreement that has binding commitments on both sides, you're going to be more inclined to go there. It's as simple as that. And that seems to be what's happening. The final point that they make, that we've made many times on this podcast before, is this all takes time. And it's more complicated than just government sticks and carrots. Companies make decisions based on their own business models and what they perceive as good for them, and they do it over a period of years. So 10 years from now, supply chains are going to look very different. 6 months from now, not so much.
No, I think that's a fair summary, Bill. And, for me, these are two gigantic economies with a very large trading relationship, the U.S. and China. And so that the current trading relationship and the current configuration reflects both the scale of the economies and specialization, which has taken place, and that's why there's so much trade between the two economies. Anytime you try to replicate scale or unwind specialization, or replicate that somewhere else, you are pushing water uphill in strategic terms. It's not surprising that it's been limited and slow moving and is limited to a few sectors. I was struck by the fact that the sectors that were identified by Rhodium are the ones that have had about 60 years of geographic mobility. Go back to the original project in the 1960s that METI undertook on behalf of Japanese electronics and automotive manufacturers when Japan was really running out of workers and wanted to diversify their employment base. That's where the original Asian tigers came from. Okay, and then there's a whole decade or so of regional free trade agreements along with the information technology revolution that shuffled the deck again, and then China became the center of factory Asia in supply chains. A lot of the action has been in these sectors, automotive, electronics, and textiles and apparel, for quite some time. And those are sectors that know how to move. There's an expertise there that's built into their geographic flexibility, which I thought was fascinating. But Bill's right. The bottom line here is investment. Okay. And in creating some stability and predictability for investment regimes is the key element. I've made that point maybe 4 times on this program with respect to Mexico. Mexico has incredible advantages in terms of access to the U.S. market, but to take advantage of that access that they have through trade agreements and through proximity, you need investment. And you need a stable, predictable regime to attract the investment. We're not doing a very good job in that area. Most of the capital exporting nations are backing away from commitments they've made in investor protection, and they're not making any new commitments. There's no ongoing negotiation. We have an expansion of financial sanctions. I think the United States has about 20% of world GDP under some sanction or another right at the moment, which hurts investment. We're contemplating things like seizing assets of adversaries. Both the U.S. and Europe, in part of NATO meetings, have talked about seizing Russian assets. That is not consistent with the rule of law and investment stability. I mean, as much as it appears attractive. So I think we've got work to do in investment if we want to make this happen. That's going to take a very different agenda than the one we have.
I think Scott's right about that. It reminds me that one of the reasons for that is that neither the last administration nor the current one is really very interested in that. It was Ambassador Lighthizer rather famously told business people early in Trump's term, I don't want you to invest in Mexico. I want you to invest in the United States. And the Biden approach has been very similar, reshoring, come back here. And, we can talk about whether that's a good thing or not, but one of the consequences of that is it doesn't help diversification away from China. So, it's rather simplistic to argue we're for diversifying away from China. We want American companies to come back to the United States. Well, American companies are not going to come back to the United States for a lot of reasons.
It's also possible to make the U.S. a great place to invest while protecting U.S. investment abroad. They're not an either or.
Yes.
No matter how emphatically Ambassador Lighthizer might have stated that. You can do both.
We've seen, however, that both administrations seem to be locked into a zero-sum review on investment. A dollar invested in Mexico is by definition a dollar not invested in the United States. And it really can be win-win, exactly like Scott said.
Yes. It's the capital version of the lump of labor fallacy in classical economics. So it's not as if there's some lump of capital that only goes one place. It's an asset that tends to multiply when it's treated well.
Okay, let's wrap it there. To the insomniacs, we say good night. To everyone else, we say we will see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasant dreams.
To our listeners, if you have a question for the Trade Guys, write us at tradeguys@csis.org. That's tradeguys@csis.org. We'll read some of your emails and have the Trade Guys react to it. You've been listening to The Trade Guys, a CSIS podcast.